Russia is continuing its war against Ukraine. US President Donald Trump has threatened to impose harder sanctions, but seems to be waiting. In the Senate, there is a draft bill to impose secondary sanctions on Russian energy exports, 500% tariffs on countries importing oil, gas, petroleum and uranium. Could this work? Our guest is Edward Fishman, a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. He served as Russia and Europe sanctions lead and as a member of the policy planning staff at the US Department of State during the Obama administration. Hello, Edward.
Hi, Roman. Thanks for having me on today.
To begin with, why do you think is Donald Trump so reluctant to impose harder sanctions against Russia?
For some reason, Donald Trump has decided that more sanctions on Russia is going to stop Putin from being serious about negotiations. The thing that I highlight in my foreign affairs article that came out recently is that this is very different from Trump's approach to really every other country. When it comes to China, he's shown no compunction about imposing tariffs on China at the same time as he's negotiating a trade deal. With respect to Iran, he's been imposing significant sanctions on Iran at the same time that he's pursuing a nuclear deal. So in virtually every other instance, Trump believes that coercion and diplomacy are compatible. But for some reason, with respect to Russia, he considers them mutually exclusive. And I think that policy so far has not yielded very many results. So hopefully he's about to change course.
Let's take a deep dive into your article on the foreign policy that you've just mentioned. You are arguing that Donald Trump should learn from the Obama administration. Well, we shall not discuss that he actually doesn't like the Democrats and is very unlikely to take an example from Obama or Biden. But anyway, your idea is take Iran sanctions as an example. What exactly do you suggest?
Sure. So I think there are interesting parallels between the situation with respect to Russia sanctions today and the situation on Iran sanctions in the first year of Obama's presidency. Similar to Trump today, Obama, when he came into the White House in 2009, wanted to reach out a hand to Iran, a bitter adversary. And very few people in the American political spectrum believed that Obama's diplomacy would work. He spent about the first 6 to 12 months of his presidency pursuing negotiations with Iran that ultimately went nowhere. When those negotiations failed, a bipartisan supermajority in Congress, so both Republicans and Democrats, including Obama's own allies, teamed up to pass tougher and tougher sanctions against Iran over the next several years. These sanctions were really important because they really created a serious threat of secondary sanctions. They made it very clear to banks around the world that if they were transacting with Iran, that they would face cutoff from the U.S. financial system. This was enshrined in U.S. law. The most important of these sanctions, though, Roman, come in 2011, at the very end of the year, when Congress passes a law that imposes secondary sanctions on anyone that's transacting with the Central Bank of Iran, paying Iran basically for its oil sales, with the exception that if you reduce your purchases of Iranian oil every 6 months and only pay money into escrow accounts that can be used for humanitarian trade, then you have an exception from the sanctions. And this was the critical sanction because it drove down Iran's oil sales by about 60% in 18 months, and it locks up almost $100 billion of Iran's oil revenues in overseas escrow accounts.
So what's your suggestion for the Russia sanctions? Because as far as I understand, you don't believe that bill, as we know it, will ever be implemented. It seems too hard, or it would have too hard effect on the world economy. So what's your idea?
Yeah, look, I think the Graham-Blumenthal bill is a very welcome enterprise. I think the congressmen are doing the right thing in terms of putting pressure on the administration. However, as written, the bill will never be implemented because what it threatens is 500% tariffs on any country that's buying any energy from Russia at all. So that would mean that China or India or the European Union, which is still buying liquefied natural gas from Russia, or Japan, which is still buying energy from Russia, would face 500% tariffs by the US if they continued. And to me, that threat is just not credible because we already saw Trump couldn't even sustain 145% tariffs on China for even a few weeks. So the idea that he's going to impose 500% tariffs on all these countries just doesn't strike me as plausible. So I think if this bill were to be passed as written, the likeliest outcome is that Trump would simply invoke a national security waiver and not implement that part of the bill. So what I think is urgent right now is I think it's important for the Trump administration to come to the table with Congress and negotiate something that is more practical and that actually could build significant leverage over Putin.
What could it be?
I think you got to go back and look at that really successful Iran example from 2011 and 2012. Just like Russia today, Iran at the time was a major oil exporter. They're selling 2.5 million barrels of oil on international markets each day. And similar to today, there were real fears in Washington that imposing sanctions on Iranian oil could cut oil supplies to the market and lead to a spike in prices and maybe even worsen inflation. That has been why, for instance, Joe Biden was so reluctant to impose oil sanctions on Russia. What the Iran sanctions did, though, were so intelligent about them. They did two things. One is they didn't tell countries that they had to stop buying Iranian oil completely overnight. They said you just have to bring down your purchases. You had to reduce them every 6 months. And so what this did is it created sort of a glide path in which countries like China and India and Turkey, the same countries right now buying Russian oil, could reduce their purchases of Iranian oil every 6 months. And it sent a signal to other market participants like shale producers in the United States to pump more oil to keep the market balanced. And then the second part of it, Roman, was that it said that you could only pay for Iranian oil if it goes into these escrow accounts that could only be used for humanitarian transactions. This could easily be applied right now to China, where you could tell Chinese banks that if they're going to pay for Russian oil, they have to pay into a Russian bank account in China, and that the funds can only be released to buy consumer goods from China. They can't be released to buy drones or military equipment or any other components that could be used for Putin's war machine.
Let's imagine that your suggestion will be implemented. So there will be sanctions, and countries buying Russian energy products will have to reduce the amount, and it will be reviewed every 6 months. And then the revenues will stay in those countries. So the money will stay, but Russia can buy some goods there, like medical supplies or food or whatever. How do you think China will react? Since you've mentioned China, China is a major buyer of Russian oil and other Russian energy products, but also Europe, because Europe is still buying Russian LNG gas.
Yeah, I think both China and Europe would comply. Europe is obviously the easier case because the Europeans already have a goal of cutting themselves off from Russian energy entirely by 2027. So in some ways, all this regime would do is just give them a further incentive to hit their goals. China, of course, is the hardest part of this puzzle because the Chinese are not at all party to the sanctions regime. What I would note is the same was true for the Iran sanctions in 2011, 2012, and the Chinese did comply. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first is there's a real threat of secondary sanctions. If Congress is coming and saying that you will be sanctioned unless you comply with these terms, these big Chinese banks actually will have to cut off from the dollar and cut off from the U.S. financial system if they don't comply. So and Chinese banks historically have shown very, very serious caution about violating American secondary sanctions. Even today, China relies on the dollar for 70% of its cross-border payments externally. So China is still heavily dependent on the dollar. The second reason, though, that I think is just as important is Chinese companies would actually have a positive incentive to comply. They would actually not just be a stick, but also a carrot. Because if you think about it, if payments for Russian oil have to stay in China, they can't go anywhere else, that means that every single dollar that Chinese refineries are paying for Russian oil has to be recycled into the Chinese economy. It has to be used by Russia to buy imports from China. So the Chinese will like this because if anything, it will actually wind up boosting Chinese exports to Russia. And by the way, the same logic applies to India and Turkey as well.
Do you think that the risks are manageable? Because the Russian share of oil on the world market is greater than that of Iran.
I do, yes. So that's right. I think that's an important point. I don't want to by any means suggest that this will be easy. Russia is producing more than twice the amount of oil today than Iran was in the period that I mentioned. But what I would note today is that back then, oil prices were well above $100 a barrel. We had an incredibly tight oil market in 2011, 2012. Today, we've got a very loose oil market. We've got Brent hovering in the 60s. We've got oil supplies growing significantly faster than demand this year. It looks like the market might be oversupplied by as much as 1 million barrels a day. So cutting Russian oil sales by even 1 million, maybe 2 million barrels shouldn't actually have that much of a price impact. We also have OPEC right now that's increasing production. So I actually think that even though Russia is a big and powerful energy supplier. Because of the market dynamics right now, there actually is quite a bit of leeway to take some Russian supply off the market.
Okay. What about Russian uranium? Because it's also part of the bill that senators have proposed, Graham and Blumenthal. So Western countries are very much dependent on Russian uranium, and it has been untouched by sanctions so far. Do you see this changing?
I do, yeah. I think the United States, even to this day, imports some nuclear fuel from Russia. There's clearly a determination in the US to stop importing that nuclear fuel. I think something that's important to note is that it's not actually the raw uranium that Russia is dominating. It's actually the enriched uranium that then's fashioned into nuclear fuel that's usable in reactors. We have this capability in the United States. There are many other countries that have this capability. We just need to start doing it at production grade. My own view is that the uranium problem isn't actually that big of a deal, though, because if you look at it in terms of revenue, Russia's making not that much money. It's in the sort of low single-digit billions of dollars selling nuclear fuel every single year. You compare that to oil, where they're making hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So while I think it's good for us in the U.S. and good for the Europeans to cut down our purchases of nuclear fuel from Russia to stop that reliance, I don't think it's necessarily as important in terms of pressuring the Russian economy.
Let's talk about Europe, because you argue that Europe should go forward and impose harder sanctions against Russia, hoping that the United States will follow. But actually, it has never been like this. Europe has always been kind of hiding behind Washington. Why do you think that Brussels will start now?
I'm not telling you I know they will. I think they should. And there are clearly voices in Europe right now that are in favor of tougher sanctions against Russia. I think that Chancellor Merz in Germany has been a powerful leader in this area. And so I do think that it's possible. My argument that I make in the piece is that the Europeans should not be waiting around for Trump to act. Clearly, Trump is very reluctant to ramp up pressure on Russia. I think if the Europeans sit around waiting, they may be waiting forever for Trump to make any move against Russia. So I think that the best move for the Europeans would be to act with determination and confidence. This is, after all, right in their backyard. Impose tougher sanctions on Russia. And my own expectation is if the Europeans show some determination, it actually may make Trump feel a bit competitive, make the Congress feel competitive and say, okay, well, the U.S. needs to move tough in a determined fashion as well. And I would note that there was some of this dynamic in 2011 where Obama was very much on the fence about these key Iran oil sanctions that I mentioned earlier. And really the thing that pushed the Congress over the edge to actually pass this bill, and by the way, they passed it almost unanimously in the Senate and the Congress, is that the Europeans imposed an oil embargo on Iran at the end of 2011. And that really did push Congress to act back then as well.
Well, for me, sitting here in Berlin, in Germany, it sounds very unlikely that the Europeans would go a step further and seize the initiative, because under the Obama administration, the Europeans were very much keen on coordinating the sanctions policy with Washington. Now there is the trade war between Europe and the United States, which Europeans hope to resolve. They still hope that Trump will continue supporting Ukraine with weapons, that he will not walk away. But such a step, imposing sanctions, whereas Trump is still waiting, seems to be very unlikely.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think anyone who's ever bet on European determination probably wound up losing that bet. Oftentimes the Europeans are slower to act than you'd want. But I would say they have shown real leadership with respect to the Ukraine file in recent years. They provided substantial assistance to Ukraine. They've imposed really significant sanctions. The central bank sanctions, while of course this is a G7 action, it was most meaningful that the European Union took this action because you have most of the Russian sovereign assets sitting in European bank accounts. So the Europeans deserve a lot of credit for the resolve that they've shown over the Ukraine war. I think that what I'm arguing today is that instead of letting that resolve flag because of Trump, clearly going a bit soft on Russia, I think the Europeans should act with determination.
In your article, you're also suggesting that Europe should go ahead and give those $200 billion frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. So far, Europe has been reluctant to do so. So why do you think they will change their mind?
Again, I don't know if they're going to change their mind. I'm saying they should do this. This, by the way, is long overdue. it's very challenging. We're democracies in the US and Europe. It's challenging over time to convince your taxpayers that they need to be spending, tens of billions of dollars every single year to support Ukraine. I mean, I think it's worth it personally, but I understand why it's a hard political sell. We have nearly $300 billion worth of Russian assets sitting in bank accounts in the West. That is enough to fund Ukraine for several years, to give them a significant financial runway. I think that this opportunity is one that we would be foolish not to seize. We already have the legal authority to do this in the US. The Canadians have the authority to do it. The British have the authority to do it. The Europeans are the kind of missing link and the most important one because most of the assets sit in Europe. I think the other important thing is to think about negotiations from Putin's standpoint. Putin is not going to negotiate in good faith if he thinks time is on his side. If he thinks he can just wait and with each passing day, Russia's position will be stronger, he'll be closer to maximal victory in Ukraine, he's not going to negotiate seriously. I think if the Ukrainians all of a sudden have a $300 billion trust fund that they can use to buy weapons to fund a war against Russia for many years into the future, that calculus for Putin has to change. He has to start thinking, maybe it is time to try to see what I can get now, because maybe next year and a year after that, I'll be in a worse position vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Let's come back to the Graham bill. What is realistic, do you think? So the draft can be softened and then signed by Donald Trump. Is it possible? Is it realistic?
I do think it's realistic. I still think it's about a coin flip whether or not this will happen. We have yet to see in the U.S. serious willingness by Republicans to do something against the president's wishes. So I do think in some ways you are going to need Trump to signal that he's okay with signing this bill. That's why what I'm really trying to do in my foreign affairs essay that we've been talking about is provide a framework that the Trump administration can use to go when they talk to Graham and Blumenthal to negotiate a compromise, because it's clear that the White House doesn't like this version of the bill. They want to soften it. And my own view is you can actually make it less draconian on paper, but actually make it much, much more impactful in practice. And so I'm hoping that the Trump administration takes my recommendations.
Well, there is one thing that you are not mentioning in your foreign affairs essay, and that is Trump's election slogan, "Drill, baby, drill." Do you see any movement on that, and how could this affect Russian oil revenues?
Yeah, no, this is a great point. And that's actually another reason why I think that there actually is quite a bit of leeway to take Russian barrels off the market. One of Trump's constituencies that has been very upset with his policies so far is the oil industry, because Trump came in saying he's going to be the most oil-friendly president we've had in years, that he's going to create American energy dominance. But so far, all he's been doing is pushing the Saudis to pump more oil, trying to flood the market to bring down the price of gasoline, which may be good for American consumers, but is terrible for the U.S. oil industry. Because in shale production, you need an oil price that is stable, that's ideally above $60, $70 a barrel for them to be profitable. And so I think bringing some Russian supply off the market would lead, I think, probably temporarily to a little bit of a bump in prices that then shale producers could use to actually take advantage of some of this regulatory loosening that Trump has done to drill, baby drill, to produce more oil. And so I think that in some ways, these sanctions that I'm recommending are not only good from a perspective of Russia policy, but also very much aligned with Trump's own stated goal of American energy dominance.
Assuming, once again, that there will be sanctions on Russian oil exports, how long do you think it will take to impress Vladimir Putin to change his calculus and end this war? Because on Iran, as you state, it took 1.5 years.
Yeah, I think it'll take a long time. I mean, this is one thing that I think is always important to state out front is I don't believe there's any magic bullet with respect to this war. If there was, we should have used it a long time ago. Putin is clearly very determined to trample over Ukraine. He's determined to conquer Ukraine. He's determined to effectively end Ukraine as a modern state. And I think that it's going to be very challenging to get him off that policy. I don't think you're actually ever going to persuade Putin that Ukraine deserves to be a sovereign state. I think what you have to persuade him is that he literally cannot achieve his maximalist objectives. And so I think sanctions are a very important part of that, because what they do is they put Russia in a much tougher economic position to actually achieve its goals. But I think another critical part of that is the support to Ukraine. And that's why I do think the most impactful step we could do, really even more so than this Graham-Blumenthal bill, is to seize these Russian sovereign assets and use them to fund Ukraine well into the future.
Thank you very much, Edward Fishman, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University.